Hi, I'm Tripp Harrison with Twiford Funeral Homes. I'm out of the Manteo location, which is on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And we're going to deal today with some of the logistics of handling a death when someone close to you passes away. We're going to talk about the first 48 hours, which, like the television show, implies there's 48 hours to handle some critical things. And a lot of times it's a difficult time to be handling things that are have long-term ramifications. So I want to go through some quick tips for you if you're in this situation. Almost all of us have dealt with the passing of a loved one, but maybe we haven't been the one in charge. And not that there's necessarily a person in charge every time there's a death, but typically there's a point person, the one who will be either making the decisions or communicating the decisions that are made to the funeral professionals. And if you are that point person, you're going to be playing different roles as that point person in the logistics of the funeral arrangements. So let's talk about those roles real quickly. First of all, you will be a comforter to your family. No one is happy when someone passes away. We talk about the happiness of them going to a better place and the joy that we feel in their release from this earthly life, but still there is sadness, and you will be acting as a role of comforter. You'll also be, in many cases, a caretaker. The person left behind or the family left behind may have relied on the person who is now dead to handle things in their life that will have to be redistributed to people who are there to provide for them. And as the point person, you are the logistics coordinator. And that's the part that we're here to talk about today. I'm not a counselor. I'm a funeral director. And so what we can deal with and give you information about is the details of the logistics that need to be handled at that time. The difficult thing about it is that you are also dealing with the emotions of this loss yourself. And in many cases, you still have your day-to-day responsibilities, especially if you have children, small children at home, or you have a job that doesn't permit you to take an extended amount of time off. It's a big burden sometimes to carry, and it's great to have some sort of ground rules and some sort of a guidebook for going in. So I have 4 rules for you that are important to remember if you're the person in this position. The first rule, which I think is the most important, is don't try to be Superman or Wonder Woman. You're a human being. You're upset as well. And sometimes it is human nature for certain personalities to want to take on the world, and they lose their ability to grieve, or sometimes hide their desire to grieve behind the busyness of funeral arrangements. And I want to stress that it's very important that everyone in their own way understand the loss that has happened and to deal with it personally. So don't throw yourself into the details of planning to the point where you haven't dealt with your own emotions and feelings, because that's very, very important. At the time of death of a loved one, whoever is taking care of that loved one, whether they're sometimes in a hospital or maybe they're at home or maybe it's an unexpected death, each of those scenarios is very different. But we'll talk today about the most simple scenario, is that someone has succumbed to illness and they are under the care of we'll just use the example of a hospital or a nursing home. And once your loved one has passed away, the first job then of the establishment where your loved one is to ask you what you would like to do with their remains. And that decision is usually required to be answered fairly quickly, because once your loved one has passed away, it's no longer their responsibility to care for them, obviously. So that care needs to be transferred, and so they will typically want an answer as to what their next step should be to transfer your loved one into someone else's care. And that's a pretty big decision to begin to formulate in your head already funeral arrangements and whether you want a cremation or a burial, or who should be at the funeral, or if there should even be a funeral. And those are things that take some time to think through. So if you don't know this, you need to have enough time to be able to make qualified decisions. Most decisions that are this significant as to what the final disposition of your loved one will be are decisions that we take a long time or a longer time than we do for most decisions. When you buy a home or you buy a car even, typically we'll do a little due diligence and we'll talk to people who live in the neighborhood or who own a similar car or what have you. And I think in the compromised emotional position that people are in often when they're being asked to make arrangements, they don't have that option of making, or they don't think they have that option of making a qualified decision. So we're going to give you rule number 2 is to not feel rushed. And how can we not feel rushed when we have the hospital nurse or the physician asking us, what do you want us to do with dad or mom, for example? The important thing to know is that their position is we need to get your loved one out of our facility so that we can continue our work here. So we can contact, or you can contact, any funeral home to make the removal of your loved one from that facility. We use the term removal in our industry. Basically, it's where we go to the place of death and we take the loved one into our care. And when we take them into our care, we respectfully store their remains until we have worked out funeral arrangements with the family, or if the family has decided to do something different, perhaps with a different funeral home. So that's the first obligation of any registered funeral home, is to be willing to remove folks who have passed away from their place of death and take them into their care. What you may need to know, if you don't know already, is that because you're being pressed for that decision quickly, you can select any funeral home to do the removal. You can call any funeral home that's referred to you or that you've heard of or passed or what have you, because the job of removal is required for any funeral arrangements. Obviously, you're not going to have the funeral in the hospital room. So the firm that is used to remove your loved one from the hospital and take them into their care can just do that if you ultimately decide on a different firm to handle the arrangement. So that's important to know. A lot of people who are in this position and they're asked from the hospital or the nursing home, who do you want us to call? A lot of people believe that decision is final, and that if you select someone based on nothing, or based on a quick recommendation or a name that's thrown out by people who are standing nearby, what have you, that is not necessarily an obligation to commit to that funeral home, because that funeral home, all funeral homes are required to do the removal as you requested, but then wait for further instructions from you. This gives you a little bit of time to grieve a little, comfort a little, caretake a little, and think about and do a little research perhaps on the funeral home you'd like to use. The things that I think are important in considering then, once you've had your loved one picked up by a funeral home, and of course that funeral home will ask, what would you like us to do? And it's perfectly all right to say, well, just hold them for the moment. We're going to make some decisions and we'll get back to you. Now, of course, because the nature of biology being what it is, there's not an infinite amount of time to make decisions, but there certainly is more than a few minutes in the hospital. And it gives you a little bit of breathing room there. So I have suggestions for you in terms of once you go on your hunt for a funeral home that will be able to handle the arrangements that you'll be making for this person, you need to remember these are the 4 areas we can look for. First of all, the age-old guide is to look for recommendations. Talk to people who have been in the area longer than you. Typically, hospitals and nursing homes and medical facilities are not allowed to recommend funeral homes. Obviously, that would open up the opportunity for an unfair playing field, but many of them will anyway. And you'll find that if it's not done officially, it is done often unofficially. And that's okay, if there's a recommendation that's made genuinely and from a heartfelt perspective, no matter who makes it. But it's important to talk to those primarily that have been around a while, because tenure in the community is a pretty big deal. A funeral home who is not a good provider of services to families won't be around for 50 years or 60 years, because people just won't allow that. But it is a newer world today, and we have other ways of evaluating the service of a funeral home before we select one. One of those is the way we evaluate a lot of things is through reviews. Obviously, there are the sites that people typically go to, like Google and Yelp. There is not a specific funeral home review site that we recommend. We think it's better to go to the classic consumer, other people who have had a loss, and see what they might say about a particular funeral home. And when you do look at those reviews, undoubtedly the finest firms in the world will have a family who did not feel like their needs were met or were unhappy with something in the service. So it's not uncommon to see an occasional review of any funeral home that is subpar. The important thing to look for is, was there a response from that funeral home on that review to make things right or make the party feel better about whatever they felt uncomfortable with. That's the main thing. It's unanswered bad reviews that send a real red flag. The other thing is traditions. Many of you that are part of a big family and you've used a certain firm for many years will continue to use that firm, and probably with good reason. The staff there knows everyone, and they know the particulars of the family. They know perhaps the minister or the church that the loved one has been a part of. So tradition is an important factor as well. Although, if that tradition is not felt to be necessarily one of positive memories, but this is who we've always called, I would certainly encourage you to see what else is out there. And the last thing is to remember that you will sometimes get warnings from individuals about funeral homes. Certainly not officially, but you'll have people say, whatever you do, don't call this firm or that firm. And, we weigh those things with a grain of salt, but there's certainly usually a reason behind that. So it would bear some investigation. Rule number 2 is don't feel rushed. Select the funeral home for the removal and hold your loved one until you've had a little time to make a few decisions. So what kind of time are we talking about? Typically, a funeral home will need to have some direction as to whether or not they're going to keep the loved one in their care or not within the first day or two. So, although you have some time, it's not an extremely long time, but it certainly gives you a chance to breathe a little bit. Number 3 is to do some homework in looking at a firm's reputation, to talk to those who have used the funeral home recently. Sometimes we'll find, depending on our circle of friends, someone who has been to a funeral recently, and you'll hear remarks. For example, here at our chapel in Manteo, North Carolina, we have a recently renovated chapel, which gets a lot of talk in the community. And when we had our first few services in the chapel, there was a lot of talk in our little small town about how beautiful the renovation was, and helped some people feel that it was a beautiful setting sometimes to have a funeral, rather than, as some people do, that they'll just meet outside the funeral home and have something unofficial. But with the new chapel renovations, it's very, very pretty, and it's an excellent place to have lasting memories of your loved one. So that's the kind of thing that's important too. The fourth thing, and one of the most important things, is that it's really not all about price. It seems as though lately in the funeral industry, there has been, as in every industry, a trend of people who are concerned about what's the lowest cost that they can get away with, so to speak, on a funeral or funeral service or cremation or what have you. And just to put your mind at ease that I'm not promoting expensive funerals necessarily, the price difference, for example, within our state for funeral services. Now, I'm not talking about cemetery property or caskets. I'm talking about what the funeral directors do to accommodate you from the removal to the funeral, if there is one, to the presentation of the remains, if that's part of the service. The difference in those prices in our state is 4 to 7%, from the least expensive advertised pricing to the most expensive for funeral services is in a very low range. So it's not like if you picked the wrong funeral home, you would be paying what my mother used to call hotel minibar prices. It's not one of those types of things. It's not that much different. Now, the other items that may come into play in a funeral arrangement, such as a casket, if there's a burial, or burial property, which is really the venue, or really the area of cemetery sales and the cemetery that's selected, that's really not necessarily part of the funeral director's role. And any monuments or grave markers and things like that, those caskets and urns, those things there are variations in price. But you also have the liberty of providing your own in most cases. Certainly in North Carolina, that is part of what's allowed here, is for an individual to outsource some of the purchases that are required of product in the funeral service. But the funeral services themselves, it's all pretty much the same pricing from place to place. So you really do have a choice of quality that can be made without worrying about an increased cost. So I guess my final thoughts here would be, and forgive me for looking at notes here, I don't want to forget anything. One important consideration, depending on where you are, and again, we are broadcasting from North Carolina, Outer Banks. Our parent location is in Elizabeth City, which is just north of here, about an hour and a half or so. And traditions and pricing and things vary across the country, depending on where you are. Rules and laws and what's allowed and not allowed varies from state to state. But overall, the rules are similar with a few exceptions. But one of the things I want to point out is perhaps one of the most important factors to consider in selecting a funeral home to make arrangements for your loved one, other than tenure, how long they've been in the area, is the ownership of the funeral home active in the funeral business itself. When a family firm, which is how most funeral homes in this country started, a pioneer family, for example, might have established a funeral home 100 years ago or so, like our firm, which is almost 90 years old, and it's passed down from generation to generation. Those funeral homes typically have a greater handle on the community. They know the ministers, they know the churches, they know the people in the vital statistics department to get things like death certificates and insurance paperwork completed. They know the community that they serve because they've been there a long time. There has been a wave over the years of large corporate firms purchasing smaller funeral homes that were family owned when it was time to pass the business down and the child or the recipient of the business was not interested in being in the funeral industry. So what happened, this beginning probably 30, 40 years ago, was these large companies formed and bought these little unwanted funeral homes and small funeral home chains that didn't have a recipient to pass it down to. And what the typical corporate policy on that is to leave the funeral home under the name of the family that started the funeral home, and but internally use the corporate model for pricing and selections of things like caskets or urns or services and whatnot. But it's important to know whether you're dealing with a family-owned funeral home or whether you're dealing with a formerly family-owned funeral home that is now operated by a corporate entity. It doesn't necessarily mean that the corporate funeral homes are not good and not qualified. It does make a difference, though, in who in that firm is in touch with people in the community and who knows what traditions are and who knows where cemetery property is available or knows ministers that they can talk to that would be appropriate for the service. There's something about that hometown touch that, despite having the same name it's always had, it's worth finding out if the ownership of that funeral home is still in the hands of the people who started it and their extended family. So that's an important thing to consider. And we're proud of our 90-year family tradition here at Twiford Funeral Home. We've got a lot of years in our 2 communities that we serve and a large radius of area beyond. So we're happy to serve them and happy to serve you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to comment in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer them on one of our future videos. So on behalf of Twiford Funeral Homes, this is Tripp Harrison. Thanks for visiting with me today. I'll see you next time.